Hello and welcome to the Sigma Psi Distinguished Lectureship. I'm Katie Burke, Digital Features Editor at American Scientist. I'm speaking today with Beth Middleton. She's an ecologist at the U.S. Geological Survey and an expert on wetlands. Beth, thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Katie.
So before we get started, a few tips for people who are watching the Hangout live. If you want to submit questions for Beth, then you can do so on the right side of the screen on the Google Hangout page. If you don't see something there, or if you're confused, alternatively, you can also type them on the event page in Google+. And you can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag AMSCIGHO. That's AMSCIGHO. Okay, so just to start, Beth, I really enjoyed, you wrote recently a commentary in the journal Ecosystem Health and Sustainability, and you talked about your personal connection to wetlands as you were growing up in Wisconsin. So can you talk about how you got that personal connection to the ways that people use wetlands traditionally?
Well, certainly. I did grow up next to a wetland in Wisconsin, and I live in Louisiana now, so I always tell people that I'm kind of the northern equivalent of a Cajun, because I grew up herding dairy cattle and working in sedge meadows. So I actually had, even as a child, had a real hands-on idea about how farmers and not indigenous people exactly, but how people close to the land used wetlands. And I think that's been a very important aspect in some of the career decisions I've made, and also in my understanding of how wetlands work and how management of wetlands differs between cultures.
So what were some of the ways that you saw people using wetlands where you were growing up?
Well, I grew up in a dairying area, and so the farmers used the pastures to give the cattle grazing in the summer. And so, but already by the time I was a child, the practices had changed. Agriculture had intensified a lot, so there were many more cattle in these areas than there once had been. And in talking to some of the old farmers when I was a child and a teenager, I realized that in the past they had done things like, for example, cut the hay in the sedge meadows and in the low prairies. And so I was really fascinated about how they did it, and to some extent why they did it. And so they also, in addition to grazing and also cutting these grasses, they also burned the wetlands very often. And after World War II, apparently that practice stopped. And so even though these wetlands had been grazed by something, either bison or cattle for millennia, or and burned either by these farmers or the Native Americans before them, after World War II, much of this stopped, particularly burning, and so the wetland vegetation began to change. So I'm very excited that you actually picked out this particular set of research, because in fact this was my research project for my senior thesis when I was in college, and I've continued to think and work on this for many years. It's not really my primary research project now, but I'm very fascinated that you picked that particular thing out, because it's so much a part of who I am. So I really appreciate your wanting to discuss this particular research project.
Sure. And so just going beyond that, what are some other examples from around the world of traditional knowledge of wetlands management that you see as important to preserve, or that are good examples for why these practices need to be studied and preserved?
Well, one of the things, as I became an ecologist and began to work in various places around the world, I began to realize that the traditional management practices all over the world were changing. And I talked to, for example, the Europeans, and was fascinated by the fact that it seemed that they didn't use fire very much, but they did use haying and cattle grazing. And so I was fascinated by that, why that would be. And then in going to South America, and I lived in India for several years, and even China, I began to realize that all of those old management practices were changing, and sometimes they were just being abandoned entirely. And what was happening was that the grasses were changing in those wetlands and becoming invaded by woody species. The problem is with that, in terms of biological conservation, is that the rare species tend to be the small little flowering plants that grow under the grasses, and particularly under these thickets of shrubs. And so that, along with this change in management, there was also a threatening of this biodiversity that these practices once maintained.
So that leads really well into another question I had about these rare plants, because many of these rare plants in wetlands are obscure and people may not be all that familiar with them. Do you have any favorite rare wetland species that kind of are especially good examples of why conserving them as biodiversity resources is so important?
That's a good question, because I think when you say biodiversity, it kind of draws up this kind of warm, fuzzy notion. But what it really is are these wonderful plants that grow in the wetlands that people generally don't know very well. But for me, it's things like the gentians, that these are these purple, bluish plants that have, I don't know, kind of inflated flowers, and they're just lovely. And there are orchids, and then there are all these rare sedges that no one but a well-trained botanist would really know. And so I guess one of the really tragic parts of this is that we're losing all of these species, but most people are not even really aware of it. I mean, I think people do care, but you can't care deeply about something that you're not really even aware of. So for me, part of the tragedy is that we're losing these rare species that are just so beautiful and an important part of the biodiversity. I just have to throw them back into that bigger word that people do seem to know and care about. So, but I care about each one.
Yeah. So you're based in Louisiana now, a state with many wetland conservation issues. It's now this week been 11 years since Hurricane Katrina affected your state. So since Katrina, what have you learned about wetlands conservation by studying the storm's effects?
I have done much research on storm effects, and I want to just mention that we had another big storm with really not so much wind just a few weeks ago. So Louisiana is a place where we get much flooding and many storms, and to some extent, I think the vegetation is really well equipped to deal with things like flooding and wind. And the species in the coastal wetlands, at least then the freshwater end of things, can often deal with that pretty well. For example, I work mostly on forested wetlands, cypress swamps, and people know those. These are the tall old trees with the alligators swimming around, and this is where I work now. And these particular trees are not very affected by the wind of hurricanes. So, and after I studied them on the Pearl River after Hurricane Katrina, and I saw that they really tolerated that fairly well. Other species do not. They blow down. Sometimes they're uprooted and just come out by the roots when the winds come. On the other hand, there are different kinds of storms. again, on the freshwater end of things, I started working on these same forests in the Delmarva Peninsula in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. And there I found that salinity intrusion actually had a very devastating effect on these same trees. So whereas they could deal with the wind, they couldn't deal with the salinity intrusion event. And so some of the trees in those areas are dying actually because of the high levels of salinity that came in. So I think some of the things I've learned since Hurricane Katrina are that storms as a disturbance actually has a very big effect on the kind of vegetation that you get on the coast. And the disturbances can remove species. They favor certain species. There are other species that are at a disadvantage. And so you have some effect of, depending upon what kind of storm, how much wind, how much salinity, how much flooding, it actually changes the vegetation. And that's a natural part of the dynamics. But with climate change, we can expect that these areas are going to actually shift because of the changes in the nature of those dynamics as our climates change.
Mm-hmm. And as sea levels rise, then there's going to be those kinds of effects are going to bring saline water in further inland.
Right, and saline water is definitely a problem in the freshwater wetlands.
And so, are you seeing anything with the recent flooding? Are you seeing any effects that have you had time to think about or go out to any field sites just recently?
Well, not specifically. We finished all of our field work right before the storms, and we were quite glad.
That was probably fortunate.
It's really flooded out there now. But before these particular storms, we had a lot of rain. And we were hoping that in some of our salinity intruded areas, for example, in Texas, where the salinity levels have been rising, we were hoping that we would see, because of the rains last year and this year, that the salinity levels would be starting to decrease because of all of the fresh water. And actually what we found so far is that hasn't been happening so much. We're not really sure why. I would think that after all of this flooding that we've had now, that we would see a general tendency for the salinity levels to go down in these freshwater wetlands. I guess we'll know when we go back out later this fall and to do more of our sampling.
So another big event that a lot of people have heard of that happened in the Gulf of Mexico in your area is the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which happened more than 6 years ago. It was the largest oil spill in U.S. waters. How did it affect your research on wetlands conservation, and what did you find?
I tend to work farther inland than the oil or the oiling could really affect, but there were some changes in the management of the diversions at the time. More fresh water was being released, and at that same time, the salinity levels went down in some of my freshwater forest sites, and there was a tremendous increase in production in that same year. So I think it wasn't so much the oil spill as the change in the water management that really led to the differences in the production. So,
and the changes in the water management was to flush. It was basically using the Mississippi River to flush out and keep the oil away?
Right, thanks. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't explain that very well. Yes, the diversions were opened up, many of them to their full capacity during that time, and so there was a lot more fresh water in the estuaries than normal, and so that actually changed the water and salinity regimes at the time. This is not to say that it didn't also cause a lot of problems, because it did. But the effect on the relationship anyway to the production and function of my research, my long-term research sites was that the production levels increased that year.
And so is that potentially a useful finding in in light of what might happen with the Mississippi and climate change or future management scenarios?
Well, I think so, because I think if we are in a situation where we can control the flow of the water and influence the salinity levels, we might actually be able to influence the survival of freshwater species if the salinity is rising because of drought or water extraction. And I have seen some really encouraging studies from Australia where during a major drought that they had there, they released water along the Murray River, and this actually caused the eucalyptus trees there to really, really become much healthier after that. And so they released about 2 months worth of freshwater flow, and the trees really had an increase in health after that. So I think, yeah, I do think that there could be some very useful things. I think the trick is trying to determine when the trees are stressed. You know, when exactly is it that you do this? And I think, you know, that's one of the problems in ecological management is that it's difficult to make an assessment of when a problem is occurring and how soon you actually have to respond to it to make a positive response, or even if you can. I mean, fresh water is at a premium, particularly during a drought. So it's, whereas it's useful to know this, it may not even be possible to do this if the water needs to be used elsewhere.
So one of your research focuses has been studying how climate change, along with human population growth, will affect wetlands. And as you mentioned, you've worked in India, you've worked in China, as well as your experiences along the Mississippi and in the southeastern US, as well as in Wisconsin. So can you sort of paint a picture of how you're seeing wetlands in these different places around the world being affected now, and also how they will be affected in the future?
Well, I think one of the main things that I'm seeing right now has to do less with climate change and more with land use change. There's more and more water extraction that's going on from rivers, which is really lessening the amount of water often that's available for wetlands. And of course, wetlands are their whole function is determined by the amount of water they have, and even if they are wetlands, it's all depending on water. So I think so certainly having a much more human usage, having more pollution of the water, all of this is problematic in the wetlands. And so I think it's useful when we start talking about the future to realize that part of what could be done is just the lessening of the human pressures that are being put on wetlands. And so I think that's an important element of this. As far as climate change goes, the projections of this are, you know, variable depending upon which part of the world you're talking about. Some parts of the world are expecting, you know, much more changeable conditions for flooding versus drought. You know, many parts of the world are actually in that boat, and so severe flooding, you know, followed by severe drought. You know, these are not easy conditions for plants to live in. Probably severe flooding may be, you know, something that if it's freshwater flooding, you know, in freshwater wetlands, that may not be as bad as salinity intrusion, but this is sort of one of those things where it gets to the statement, well, it depends, and it depends on, you know, just what that future may be. And one of the problems we have is we don't have very good information on what we might expect in the future, and we don't even have often good information about what's happened in the recent past. So, for example, if a local manager is trying to decide, you know, should they prepare for, you know, drought or flooding, sometimes I don't really have the information about what's even happened in the last 50 years. So it's really interesting to see that recently there are some better regional projections of what's going on, which I think is very helpful, because if you're talking about what to do about climate change, you really have to understand, what's happening and then what's likely to happen in the near future in order to really make any, good inroads into preserving wetlands or preserving biodiversity. Again, that really general word.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from the audience asking about, can you talk about balancing the natural evolution of wetlands versus preserving them as they are? Wetlands often evolve and shift over time in location, but in the modern world, they have nowhere to go, so we tend to want to conserve in place.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yes, wetlands are very changeable through time, and there is some thought that, for example, the meandering of a river across the floodplain is part of its renewal and change over time. So yes, certainly constraining a wetland in a particular place causes a situation where you don't have these natural changes in geomorphology, and you don't have the opportunities for species to change anew. So yeah, that's a very good question, and maybe even a very good point that's within that question.
So what are some of the wetlands in most need of people's protection that you've, or most need of maybe people's attention? What are, from all over the world, where are ones that just really have pulled you as ones that people should know about? It's a tough question, I know.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's like, taking all of your pets and deciding which one's your favorite. Of course, the immediately what sprang to mind, I guess I'll go with that, are the wetlands of my childhood, which were fens with springs, and one of the threats to them is that since they're in the north, that the temperatures will become hotter, and that they really won't be able to have that cold spring characteristic, and they'll be overgrown by species that grow much taller and better in hotter conditions. But that's my personal worry, I guess. I mean, I think probably the wetlands of the world, if I had to choose ones that were the most threatened, would be the ones in the colder habitats of the north, because it seems that the temperatures are rising so quickly there. Permafrost wetlands are definitely in trouble.
Yeah. What about some of your work in China and India? How is it different? What sort of different wetlands conservation and policy issues and ecological issues do you see arise when you're working in a different sort of culture and under a different kind of conservation policy and a different land uses, different cultural practices?
Well, I think in India, to start with, I mean, that was the place I did my PhD dissertation, and there we were talking about monsoonal wetlands. These are wetlands. The ones that I worked on were tropical wet, dry wetlands along rivers, and those wetlands are really impacted by water extraction, and it's the same thing that we're seeing also in the U.S. and elsewhere, that so much water is being taken from the river that there's no longer enough water in the floodplains, and so that's definitely a result of human pressures and pressures for development, and I have to say that in India, given the pressures, there is still a tremendous amount of concern for wetlands and trying to make sure that wetlands have water. For example, in the Kilauea National Park, where I did my PhD dissertation, there was a situation where there was the wetlands were very dry for probably a decade, and part of it was because of development upstream from where the water was coming in before, and there has been a diversion from another river to put water into that wetland because it's definitely considered to be a very important wetland there. So I was very impressed with the fact that there is so much concern to try to improve the water situation for especially the birds there, because it's a very important bird refuge. In China, I think one of the things I've been impressed with there has been that there is a growing concern about wetland restoration. There's an understanding that there has been much development of wetlands, and now there's a recognition that these wetlands are really very valuable for humans, and so there is quite a lot of work going on now in wetland restoration, which is really surprising and something that I've only seen happening in the last maybe 5 to 10 years. So
that's great.
Yeah, it is great.
We have another question from the audience. Population control could facilitate climate moderation, as could modified human behavioral factors. Are there actions which might actually be possible to control environmental degradation, and what are they? It's kind of a big question.
Yes. Well, I think environmental degradation is, we know what it is. And it's. I think we just need to decide that our wetlands or whatever kind of natural environment we're trying to protect is important enough to do that, apart from whatever economic interests that we get from the area. So we just have to prioritize that and say, okay, we're going to try to lessen or eliminate the pollution that's coming into a particular wetland, or we need to be sure that that we're not extracting all of the water, upstream of the wetland. These things are all just part of the will to actually keep the natural environment natural. So I don't know. That's not actually an easy thing, but I think it's partly manageable in the way we think about it.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from the audience. Do you have knowledge of the wetlands in Iraq that were drained and then restored, and is that a success story?
That is something that I have some knowledge about, mostly because I wrote that commentary about the traditional agricultural practices, the broken connection of traditional knowledge, and the Mesopotamian wetlands were, in my understanding, mostly drained and only very partially restored, to the extent that I think, at least according to the article on the Mesopotamian wetlands that was in Ecosystem and Health and Sustainability, there really aren't enough of the wetlands left and restored to really support the marsh Iraqi or marsh Iraqis anymore. So I think
And just so people know, what did people use the wetlands for? What were some of the traditional uses of the wetlands there?
Well, they used a lot of the reed, which is Phragmites, to make things. So they used it to make houses. They used it to make mats. Really, they used it for almost any conceivable thing. And once these wetlands were gone and these Phragmites were no longer there, they really didn't have the supplies to do these things anymore. And unfortunately, the knowledge of how to do these things is also being lost now, according to this article that was in Ecosystem Health and Sustainability. I don't have any personal knowledge of that, but that's how I know.
Mm-hmm. So how can policy help people and help governments navigate these issues? It's kind of a big open-ended question. And, you know, have you talked to policymakers? When you do, what do you say to them?
Well, I'm a U.S. government scientist, so let me start by saying I don't make policy, and I only talk to policymakers when asked. So I guess I'd like to say about that question that I don't do policy. So I mean, the research that I do, I think, is important to the policymakers because I think they can better understand how the systems work. But I don't directly work in policy at all, which is almost my duty to say. So
sure. So we're getting on time to close up. Do you have any questions that you wish I'd asked you, or do you have any sort of closing comments or things that you'd like to say that you think are important for people to know?
Well, I think wetlands are incredibly important, to humans, and I feel very passionate about trying to preserve them, and so very much about what motivates the research I do, and about the talks I give, has to do with this underlying desire to try to do my best for wetlands and the environment. So I guess that's all I want to say.
Well, thank you so much, Beth, for talking with us and walking us through some of these ecosystems and your work on them. And best of luck with the research.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.